The first thing Silas Crow heard was the scream of his mare. It cut through the October wind sharp as a knife on bone, and he dropped the fence hammer before he knew he had let it go. The sound came again from the low wash beyond the cottonwoods, wild and panicked, the kind of cry a horse gave when wire caught flesh or a shadow moved where no shadow ought to be. Silas ran. The afternoon had already turned the color of old pewter. Clouds hung low over Boise River Canyon, pressing down on the red stone cliffs and the yellowing aspens until the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He crossed the yard in long strides, one hand going to the revolver at his hip, the other catching the rail as he vaulted the corral fence. His gray mare, Mercy, had backed herself against the brushline, eyes rolling white. A strip of bloody hide showed along her foreleg where she had struck a broken length of rusted wire half buried in the weeds. It was not deep enough to lame her, but enough to frighten her, and fear in a horse could kill quicker than blood loss if a man handled it wrong. "Easy," Silas said. His voice was low, dry, steady. The same voice men in Boise City said had not changed even when 3 rustlers lay dead at Dry Creek Ford. "Easy now, girl." Mercy trembled, nostrils wide, her breath coming in hard, white bursts. Silas moved slow, one boot at a time, palm open. The wind worried at his coat. Somewhere above the ridge, a raven called once and went silent. He got close enough to touch her neck, then he saw movement on the road. A figure stood beyond the cottonwoods where the dirt track bent toward his cabin. Not a man, too slight, no horse beside her, no wagon, just a young woman standing in the gray afternoon light with a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and a folded paper pressed against her chest. Silas stilled. Mercy shifted under his hand, but he kept his palm against her warm neck. The woman did not move. She looked as if she had walked past the end of her strength and had only pride left to hold her upright. For a moment, Silas wondered if she was a ghost. The canyon had a way of making ghosts out of living things. Dust, grief, distance, hunger, they all wore the same color out here. He eased Mercy loose from the wire, spoke to her until the terror left her eyes, then led her back toward the corral. The woman remained where she was. By the time he latched the gate, she had come nearer, stopping at the foot of his porch as though an invisible line had been drawn there, and she dared not cross it. Silas stood 10 feet from her. He was a broad-shouldered man of 37, though hard weather made him look older when the light hit him wrong. His jaw was rough with a day's beard. His eyes were the color of canyon rain. There were men who mistook his quiet for cruelty, and women who mistook it for judgment. Both were wrong. Silas Crow had simply learned that words were like cartridges. A man did not waste them if he expected hard weather. The young woman looked at him. Her face was pale from cold and travel. Her brown hair had been pinned back without vanity, though several strands had come loose around her temples. Her boots were worn thin, the left sole nearly split. Her eyes were red but dry. That told him something. Tears had already done what they could and left her with the harder work. She opened her mouth once, closed it, swallowed. "My father sent me," she said. Silas felt the words before he understood them. "Who was your father?" Her fingers tightened around the paper. "Reverend Amos Hartwell." The wind moved through the aspens behind her, and for one long second, Silas was not in his yard anymore. He was 7 years back, lying in mud and rain near the Snake River Trail with an arrowhead buried in his left shoulder and fever burning through him like a brush fire. He remembered a man's voice above him, calm as scripture and stubborn as mule bone. He remembered being lifted when he could not stand. He remembered 8 miles of darkness, rain running into his mouth, and Amos Hartwell carrying him as though saving one half-dead stranger was simply the work God had set before him that night. Amos had sat beside him for 2 nights afterward while the fever tried to take him. Never asked for money, never asked for land, never asked for a promise. Silas looked at the young woman again. "You're Eliza," she nodded once. "Your father's dead." 3 weeks. The words came plain, but something in her face broke around them. Fever took him in 4 days. He was speaking on Monday. By Thursday morning, he could not lift his hand. Silas said nothing. Grief was not a thing he had ever known how to dress up. Eliza looked down at the porch boards. "The house is gone. Father owed more than he let me know. The man who held the note took it 2 days after the burial. I owe 3 months at Mrs. Greer's boarding house in Boise City, and she says if I have not paid by Friday, she will put my trunk in the street." Her chin lifted, then sudden and sharp. "I am not here begging. I did not say you were." "No? But folks hear a woman has no roof and they start measuring her for pity before she finishes speaking." Silas studied her. There it was, Amos Hartwell's iron shaped into a daughter. She held out the folded paper. He wrote this before he died. Silas stepped forward and took it. The paper was soft at the creases, as if she had opened and closed it many times, but could not bear to leave it behind. The handwriting was Amos's, cramped and careful. My Eliza is too proud to ask for help and too good to be left to the mercy of people who price kindness by the pound. I know what I'm asking. I know what you are, and I know what men say you are. Those are not always the same thing. You owe me nothing. That is why I trust you with this. Look after her. A. Hartwell. Silas read it once, then again. He folded it with care and held it in both hands. Eliza watched him as if his silence might decide whether she stood or fell. My father said you were the only man left in Idaho Territory who still knew what a promise was worth. The word struck him harder than accusation would have. Silas turned his face toward the canyon ridge where the last light sat dull and red along the stone. Promise. That was a word from another life. A word from before, gunsmoke, before loneliness, before men learned to cross the street rather than meet his eyes. How long before Mrs. Greer puts you out Friday? Any kin? None that claim me? Money? Her mouth tightened. Enough for one meal if I do not mind it being poor. Silas looked back at his cabin. It was a one-room thing with a sagging porch, a stone chimney, and a roof that complained whenever the wind came down hard from the ridge. Inside were a cot, a stove, a table, 2 chairs, 1 shelf of books, and more silence than any decent house ought to hold. It was not much, but it was not the street. Come inside, he said. Her chin rose again. I told you I'm not asking charity. I know. Then, what are you offering? Silas looked at her directly. A name. She stared at him. The wind dragged a dry aspen leaf across the porch between them. A legal one, he said. Circuit judge comes through Boise City Thursday. Civil marriage. Plain. No church bells, no foolishness. You would have standing a roof and the right to remain on this land. In return, you help with the account's winter stores, garden and house. This place is more than one man can keep properly, and I have done a poor job pretending otherwise. Eliza's face had gone still with shock. You do not know me. I knew your father. That is not the same. It is enough for me. Her hand went to her throat, gripping the shawl. People will talk. People talk when corn grows crooked. It does not straighten the stalk. For the first time, something almost like a smile touched her mouth. It disappeared so quickly he might have imagined it. And if I say no, then I hitch the wagon and take you back to Boise City before dark. I pay Mrs. Greer what is owed, and you decide your road after that. That would be charity. That would be respect for your father. Her eyes searched his face, looking for greed, loneliness, hunger, cruelty, all the things a woman alone had to look for if she wanted to live. Silas let her look. He had nothing handsome to offer, nothing gentle in his reputation, nothing polished in his manner. Only the truth of what he had said. At last he opened the cabin door. Warmth breathed out, carrying the smell of stove ash, coffee leather, and old wood. Eliza stepped inside like a person entering a church after losing faith, but not yet forgetting how to pray. The cabin was bare, but clean. Silas poured coffee into a tin cup and set it before her. She took it with both hands, holding it close, as if warmth itself were a mercy she had not expected. He placed Amos's letter on the table between them. Outside, the mare settled in the corral. The wind pressed against the shutters. A long night was coming down from the ridge, and beyond it waited Boise City, the judge, the boarding house, the watching eyes, and all the consequences of a decision made between 2 strangers over coffee and grief. Eliza looked at the letter. Then at Silas. Thursday, she asked. Thursday. She gave one slow nod. Silas did not smile. Eliza did not relax, but the cabin seemed less empty than it had an hour before, and the old letter lay there in the lamplight like Amos Hartwell himself had taken a seat at the table and was waiting to see whether the living would have courage enough to obey the dead. Thursday came cold enough to make the water trough wear a skin of ice. Silas Crow woke before the first gray line of morning showed over Boise River Canyon. He had not slept much. The cabin had been quiet through the night, but it was not the same quiet he had known for 8 years. There had been another breathing presence beyond the curtain he had hung across the far corner. A chair had moved once. Floorboards had sighed beneath a careful step. Near midnight, he had heard Eliza Hartwell turn over and whisper something too soft for him to understand. Maybe a prayer. Maybe her father's name. Silas had lain still in the dark, and stared toward the black square of the window, feeling the strange weight of another person's grief inside his walls. Now he rose without lighting the lamp. He stirred the stove, laid in kindling, and set coffee to boil. Outside, the wind had stripped most of the gold from the aspens, leaving the branches dark and bare against a pale sky. The mare lifted her head from the corral when he stepped onto the porch, then lowered it again when she saw it was him. Silas washed in cold water until his hands ached. He took his hunting knife from the shelf and used the blade as a poor mirror while he shaved by the stove. The face looking back at him from the steel was not much improved. Hard jaw, weathered skin, a scar under the left cheekbone, eyes that had seen enough men die to stop expecting innocence from the world. There was nothing to be done about the face. He found a dark wool shirt folded at the bottom of his trunk. His mother had sent it west with him years ago, back when she still believed he might attend church on Sundays and write letters on holidays. He had worn it twice, both times for burials. He put it on anyway. When he stepped outside, Eliza was already by the fence. She wore a dress the color of winter sage gray-green and modest at the throat with small pearl buttons down the front. It had been brushed, pressed, and mended carefully at one cuff. Her brown hair was pinned back smoother than the day before, though the cold had loosened a few strands near her temples. She stood straight, hands folded before her, looking less like a woman who had walked to his porch with no roof left in the world, and more like someone determined not to let the world know what it had taken from her. Silas stopped at the porch step. "You look well," he said. Eliza glanced down at the dress. "It was my mother's, the only good one I brought. Then it has served 2 good women." Her eyes lifted to his face. For a moment she looked as though those plain words had reached some place in her she had not meant to leave unguarded. Then she nodded. The ride into Boise City was quiet. The wagon wheels cut through frozen ruts and the horses blew steam into the morning. The canyon opened slowly around them, red stone and sagebrush giving way to rougher road than to the scattered buildings of town. Boise City was already stirring. Freightmen unloaded flour and lamp oil outside the mercantile. A woman in a brown bonnet swept dust from a boardwalk that would be muddy by noon. Smoke rose from chimneys in pale ribbons. Somewhere nearby, a hammer rang against iron in steady blows. Men looked up when Silas drove past. They always did. Some touched their hats, some only watched. A few looked from him to Eliza, then back again, already building a story between them with whatever scraps their eyes could gather. Eliza noticed. Silas could tell by the stillness of her shoulders. "Eyes don't leave bruises," he said. "No," she answered, "but they do take measurements." He looked at her then and almost smiled. The land office sat beside the assay room, its windows clouded by stove heat and dust. Judge Aldous Crane received them in the back room, a barrel-chested man with a silver watch chain and the weary expression of someone who had long ago stopped expecting marriage to explain itself. "You both understand the nature of the arrangement?" the judge asked. "Yes," Silas said. Eliza's answer came a beat later. "Yes." The judge looked over the paper, dipped his pen, and called for a witness. The door opened before the clerk could step out. A man stood there with a leather apron over his shirt and one empty sleeve pinned neatly at the elbow. His beard was black streaked with gray, and his right hand was broad and scarred from years at a forge. "Tobin Reed," Judge Crane said. "You waiting on that shoeing contract I was," the blacksmith said. His eyes had moved to Eliza. "Hartwell, did you say?" Eliza straightened. "Yes. Amos Hartwell's girl." Her lips pressed together. "Yes, sir." Tobin Reed's rough face softened in a way that seemed to surprise even him. "Your father once gave me half his supper when I had no right to it. Winter of '76. I never forgot." Eliza blinked quickly. The judge cleared his throat. "Would you stand witness?" Tobin removed his hat. "I would." The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. There were no flowers, no hymn, no gathered family, no blessing, except the old judge's dry voice reading the words required by law. Eliza stood beside Silas with her hands clasped tight. Silas kept his eyes forward, though once he saw her fingers tremble and had to stop himself from reaching for them. When it was done, Judge Crane signed. Tobin signed beneath him, slowly forming each letter with care. "Mr. and Mrs. Crow," the judge said, sanding the ink. "The matter is settled." Matter. That was one word for it. Outside, the town looked no different. Wagons moved, men talked, a dog nosed at a barrel behind the mercantile. Yet something had shifted and both of them felt it. Silas offered his arm. Eliza looked at it, then at the street, then placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. They crossed the boardwalk together. By afternoon, they were back at the cabin. Nothing changed all at once. That was the mercy and the trouble of it. The same stove smoked if the wind came wrong. The same floorboard creaked near the door. The same narrow bed had to be surrendered to Eliza while Silas took his blanket near the stove. Yet the room had altered. Her trunk stood against the far wall. Her mother's dress hung from a peg. Her shawl lay folded over a chair. A woman's things did not make a home, but they did accuse a house of being empty. The first days were careful. Eliza kept to her side of the curtain. Silas kept to his tasks. They spoke of flour, firewood, lamp oil, horse feed, and winter beans. At supper they sat across from each other like two people negotiating peace after a war neither had started. Then Eliza found his account book. She didn't criticize it at first. She turned the pages slowly, one eyebrow lowering with each line. Silas watched from the stove. "That bad, I have seen worse." "Where?" "In a mining camp where the bookkeeper drank laudanum," he grunted. By the end of the week she had sorted his receipts, listed what was owed. Discovered he had been paying too much for oats and found 2 credits at the mercantile he had forgotten to collect. She mended the chicken wire, scrubbed the shelves, counted jars in the cellar, and made bread from flour. Silas would have sworn had no bread left in it. The cabin began to change by inches. Coffee was ready before he came in from feeding the horses. A clean cloth lay over the table. The lamp chimney stopped smoking because she trimmed it properly. His books, which had leaned like tired men on the shelf, stood straight. The stove took on the smell of beans bread and sage instead of ash and old grease. He didn't thank her as often as he should have. He noticed everything. 3 days after the wedding, they went to Boise City for supplies. At the mercantile, Mr. Pell tried to charge the same winter price for oats as he had charged during the shortage the year before. Eliza looked at the ledger. "That number is wrong." Pell glanced at Silas, not at her. "Price stands." "No," she said, still calm. "Last month you charged Mr. Haskins 12 cents less per sack, and his account is written 2 lines above ours." Pell reddened. From the open door of the blacksmith shop across the street, Tobin Reed laughed once under his breath. When Silas later passed the forge, Tobin leaned on his hammer and said, "That woman has Amos's eyes when somebody tries to cheat her." Silas looked back toward the wagon where Eliza was tying flour sacks with practical knots. "Yes," he said, "she does." That evening snow threatened but did not fall. The clouds held low and the cabin windows darkened early. After supper, Eliza sat with the account book open, but she was not writing. Silas noticed. "You tired?" "No." He waited. She looked around the room, the stove, the curtain, the shelf, the table between them. A house does not become a home because 2 names are written in a book. Silas let the words settle. "No," he said at last. "I reckon it becomes one when both people stop reaching for the door." Eliza looked at him across the lamplight. Something quiet passed between them. Not comfort exactly, but the first shape of it. She told him then about traveling with her father through Oregon and Idaho, through church halls, mining camps, trading posts, and river settlements. Amos Hartwell had taught her scripture sums contracts and how to tell when a smiling man meant harm. Silas told her less, but more than he had told anyone in years. He spoke of Missouri, of a horse that died 2 days after reaching Idaho, of $40 in his pocket and a stubbornness that had carried him further than wisdom would have. Afterward, the silence did not feel like a wall. The next morning, a black buggy came up the canyon road. Silas saw it from the barn and went still. Eliza was on the porch, shaking crumbs from a cloth when the buggy stopped. The woman inside wore dark wool fine gloves and silver at her throat. She looked at the cabin as if judging whether it should be allowed to stand. "Mrs. Crow, I presume," she said. Eliza folded the cloth. "Yes, I am Verena Blackwell." Silas came from the barn wiping his hands on a rag. "Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Crow." Her eyes moved between them. "I heard you had taken a wife under unusual circumstances." "Circumstances were plain enough. I'm sure they were." Verena smiled gently, which made the smile worse. "A lonely man. A homeless girl. The territory does encourage practical solutions." Eliza's face did not change. Verena turned her gaze toward the creek line beyond the cottonwoods. "I came because matters of land are rarely improved by delay. That creek has long been under disputed use by the Boise River Cattle Association. My north pasture depends on access, and the association may soon choose to reroute the flow." "That claim has no standing," Silas said. "Standing is an expensive word, Mr. Crow, often more expensive than a small farmer can afford." The wind moved over the yard. Eliza stepped down from the porch. The road back to town freezes before sundown, Mrs. Blackwell. Verena looked at her with new interest. How considerate. It was not concern, Eliza said, only information. For a moment the canyon seemed to hold still. Then Verena laughed softly and gathered her reins. A woman may learn a man's table in a month, she said. It takes longer to learn his enemies. The buggy turned and rolled back toward Boise City, black wheels cutting through the pale dirt. Silas watched until it disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Eliza came to stand beside him. She wants the creek, she said. She wants the land that holds it. Then, I need to see every deed, tax receipt, survey paper, and water record you own. Silas looked at her. The woman who had come to him with worn boots and her father's letter now stood in his yard with winter light on her face, already measuring the shape of a fight. He went inside and brought out the old tin box. That night, Eliza spread the papers across the table while the lamp burned low and the creek moved under its first skin of ice. Silas stood by the stove and watched her read, watched her finger pause over names and boundary lines, watched the cabin grow quieter around the beginning of trouble. Outside, the wind came down from the ridge. Inside, Eliza Crow bent over the land records as if the house had already become something worth defending. By January, winter had laid its hard hand over Boise River Canyon and pressed until even the creek seemed to whisper. Snow gathered in the shaded cuts beneath the red stone bluffs. The cottonwoods stood bare along the water, their branches black against a sky the color of cold iron. Each morning, Silas broke ice from the trough with the back of an axe. Each evening, Eliza counted what remained in the cellar and wrote neat figures in the account book while the stove ticked and settled beside them. They had fallen into a rhythm neither one had named. Silas rose before light, fed the horses, checked the fences, and cut wood from the deadfall along the ridge. Eliza kept the house, the records, the winter stores, and the letters that went unanswered from Boise City. At supper, they spoke more than they once had, sometimes only of Bean's weather and harness leather, sometimes of Amos Hartwell, sometimes of things they both pretended were not tender. They still slept apart. The curtain remained. But the cabin had stopped feeling divided by it. On the coldest nights, Silas would wake and hear Eliza turning pages at the table. She studied the land papers until the lamp burned low, tracing the old boundary lines with one finger, comparing deed to survey, to tax record to water claim. Verena Blackwell's visit had not frightened her away from the matter. It had fastened her to it. One night near midnight, Silas sat up from his blanket by the stove. "You will ruin your eyes," he said. Eliza did not look away from the page. "Better my eyes than our land." The word "our" hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Silas lay back down, but sleep did not come easily after that. The trouble came 3 nights later. He woke to smoke. Not stove smoke, not the low, honest smell of pine taking flame. This was sharper, meaner, oily enough to put a bitter taste on the tongue before a man had even drawn breath. Kerosene. Silas was on his feet before thought caught up with him. He grabbed his boots, shoved his feet into them, and reached for his coat and revolver in the same motion. When he threw open the door, the night struck him with cold so fierce it took the breath from his chest. Then he saw the barn. The east wall was burning. Fire crawled up the boards in orange sheets, licking at the roofline with lazy confidence. Sparks rose into the black sky and vanished among the stars. The snow around the barn glowed red, as if the earth itself had opened and shown its wound. Out in the pasture, the horses screamed and ran the fence line, their dark bodies flashing in and out of firelight. "Eliza!" He shouted once, but she was already behind him. She came out in her nightdress and boots coat, half-buttoned hair loose down her back, a bucket in one hand and a soaked blanket in the other. There was no question in her face. No panic. Only the terrible focus of someone who understood that winter hay was not property. It was life measured in dry grass. Silas ran to the pump. The handle screamed under his hand. Water burst cold into the bucket, sloshing over his fingers. Eliza seized it and ran toward the barn, her boots skidding on frozen ground. She threw water at the lower boards while Silas filled another. The smoke rolled thick and low, biting their eyes, forcing coughs from their chests. Again and again they worked. Pump, carry, throw, return. The cold water numbed Eliza's hands until she could barely close them around the bucket handle. Once she stumbled, falling hard to one knee, but she rose before Silas could reach her. "Stay back from the wall," he shouted. "If the roof catches, we lose it all." Her voice was raw but steady. He soaked the blanket and beat at the flame near the doorway, while she dragged what hay she could from the west side, coughing so hard her whole body bent with it. The fire snapped and spat above them. A beam groaned. Silas looked up and saw a line of flame catch the lower edge of the loft. For one black second, he thought they had lost. Then the wind shifted. It came down from the north, hard and sudden, pushing the fire away from the roof seam just long enough for Silas to climb onto the wagon wheel, swing the wet blanket over the burning ledge, and beat the flame down until the cloth smoked in his hands. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, the barn still stood. Barely. The east wall was charred through in 2 places. Half the stored hay was gone. The rest was wet, smoked, and scattered. The ground had frozen where water spilled, making a rough glass of the yard. Eliza stood in the snow with ash on her face and her hands red from cold. She was shaking, but not from fear alone, from exhaustion, from anger, from the knowledge of how close they had come to losing the winter. Silas found her coat where it had fallen near the porch and put it around her shoulders. She didn't thank him. Her eyes were fixed on the blackened boards. "She did this," Eliza said. Silas followed her gaze. At the base of the east wall where the fire had begun, the snow was stained and sunken. He knelt, pulled off one glove, and touched 2 fingers to the ground. When he brought them near his face, the smell was plain. Kerosene. He stood without haste, but something in him had gone still, in a way that would have frightened most men who knew what stillness meant in Silas Crow. "We need proof," he said. Eliza looked at him. "Then we find it. I will ride into town. We will ride into town." He started to answer, then stopped. Her face was pale beneath the soot. Her hair had come loose in wild strands. Her hands were raw, and her eyes held no request for permission. Silas nodded once. At first light, they searched the ground. Near the north fence line, Silas found where a horse had stood in the snow beneath the cottonwoods. The animal had shifted weight more than once, leaving deep half-moon prints. One hoof had thrown a shoe nail against stone. Farther along, Eliza found a brass button pressed into slush near the creek trail. It was small, but not plain. A raised black B had been stamped into its face. Blackwell. Silas wrapped it in a cloth and put it in his coat pocket. They drove to Boise City with the smell of smoke still in their clothes. The town had barely opened its eyes. Chimneys lifted gray breath into the morning. The mercantile door was still barred. But Tobin Reed's forge was a live orange light beating against the dark as his hammer came down on iron. Tobin looked up when they entered. One glance at their faces ended any greeting. "What burned, Haybarn?" Silas said. Tobin set the hammer down. "How bad? Bad enough." Eliza placed the brass button on his workbench. Silas showed him a bent shoe nail and the sketch he had made of the hoof mark before the sun softened the snow. Tobin studied the nail, then the sketch. He turned the nail in his fingers and frowned. "I know this work." Silas waited. "Roy Voss." Tobin said, "Shot his horse 2 days ago. Big sorrel. Left hind hoof wears uneven. I set the shoe heavier on one side." Eliza's mouth tightened. "Does Roy Voss work for Mrs. Blackwell?" "When she pays him," Tobin said. His one hand closed slowly around the nail. "If they burn a man's winter hay, they are not warning him. They are trying to bury him." The words settled in the forge like smoke. Tobin reached for his coat. "There is one more man you need before you see Ridley." They found Numa Jack near the river edge where he had laid out willow bark dried roots and small bundles of horse medicine on a blanket beside his old pony. He was northern Paiute lean and weathered, with hair tied back and eyes that seemed to miss nothing while appearing to look at very little. Tobin spoke first. Silas Crow's barn was fired in the night. Numa Jack looked at Silas for a long moment. "I remember you," he said. Silas nodded. "I remember you too. You were dying when Amos carried you." "I was. Amos said you were too stubborn to die proper." A brief, sorrowful warmth crossed Eliza's face. Numa Jack gathered his blanket without another question and rode back with them. At the barn, he moved slowly through the snow, reading what others would have trampled into meaninglessness. He found where the rider waited, where he dismounted, where he crossed to the east wall, where he spilled kerosene with a careless hand, where he mounted again in haste and turned north toward the pasture road. He stood near the creek crossing and pointed with his chin. "Horse struck stone there, left hind, heavy shoe." Tobin grunted. "That is Roy's sorrel." Numa Jack bent and lifted something from beneath a crust of snow, a small tobacco pouch stiff with frost. Sewn to one corner was another brass button, the same black B. Sheriff Thomas Ridley listened to all of it in his office without interrupting. Ridley was not a fast man. He had a long face, tired eyes, and a habit of rubbing one thumb over the other when thinking. But he was fair, and in Boise City that counted for more than quickness. "You understand what you are saying," he said at last. "Mrs. Blackwell owns more cattle than half this county put together. She does not own the law," Eliza said. Ridley looked at her, then at the button on his desk. "No, ma'am," he said. "She does not." Roy Voss was found at the Continental Saloon before noon, drunk enough to sweat and sober enough to be afraid when Ridley laid the button, the nail, the pouch, and Tobin's statement on the table. At first, Roy cursed. Then he denied. Then he blamed whiskey. Then when Numa Jack quietly described the exact path his horse had taken through the snow, Roy's face lost color. By midday, he signed a statement. Verena Blackwell had paid him $40 to burn the hay. Not the house, not the whole barn, just enough to make Silas Crow understand that winter would finish what pride began. Eliza heard the confession without speaking. Then she walked to the land office. The clerk behind the counter glanced up and frowned as if soot-streaked women had no proper business among deeds and survey books. "I need every recorded paper tied to the Crow property, the North Pasture boundary, the creek use, and the Boise River Cattle Association's claim. That is not simple work." Mrs. Eliza placed her marriage certificate on the counter. "Crow," she said. "I am Mrs. Crow. That land is my household's bread, and I will see every paper tied to it." The clerk looked toward the sheriff's office across the street, then back at her. He brought the books. That night the cabin smelled of smoke-wet wool and lamp oil. Silas's arms ached from the pump. Eliza's hands were bandaged in strips of clean cloth. Across the table lay deeds, tax receipts, old survey notes, cattle filings, and Amos Hartwell's field notebook. Eliza turned a page in the notebook and went still. "What is it?" Silas asked. She traced a line with one wrapped finger. "Father marked the original creekstone 7 years ago. The Blackwell claim uses the wrong ridge point." Silas leaned closer. "If this is right," she said, voice low, "her water claim is built on a false boundary." Outside the burned barn stood black against the snow. Inside, Eliza drew a clean sheet of paper toward her and dipped the pen. Silas watched her begin the letter, her face pale, her hand steady. Amos's old notes open beside her like a dead man still telling the truth. "Your father did not send me someone to shelter," Silas said quietly. "He sent me someone to stand with." Eliza's pen paused. She didn't look up, but something in her shoulders softened. The lamp burned low between them while the ink dried, and beyond the walls winter held the canyon in its teeth. But for the first time since the fire, Silas felt no loneliness in the fight ahead. By the time Roy Voss's confession reached the ears of Boise City, the story had already grown legs longer than truth. Men repeated it outside the mercantile with their collars turned up against the cold. Women carried it from the church steps to the wash lines behind their houses. By supper, half the town knew that Silas Crow's hay barn had burned. By breakfast the next day, the other half knew Verena Blackwell's name had been spoken in the sheriff's office, and that was the part folks lowered their voices for. Verena Blackwell had built her life on the belief that money could make silence behave. For a while it had. She arrived at the land office 2 mornings after Roy signed his statement, dressed in black wool and silver. Her gloves fitted so cleanly they looked poured over her hands. Her buggy stopped in front of the office with a polished creak, and the driver stepped down to help her as if she were arriving at a church social instead of a public reckoning. Silas stood near the stove inside with Tobin Reed on one side of him and Sheriff Ridley on the other. Numa Jack leaned against the back wall, quiet as fence shadow. Eliza sat at the long table with the land papers arranged before her in careful stacks, Amos Hartwell's old field notebook resting open beneath her hand. She had slept little. Smoke still roughened her throat. White bandages wrapped both palms where the bucket handle had torn the skin, but her eyes were clear. Verena entered without looking at the men first. She looked at Eliza. "Well," she said softly, "it seems marriage has made you ambitious." Eliza did not rise. "No, ma'am. It has made me responsible." Judge Aldous Crane had been called from his breakfast and did not look pleased about it. He sat behind the desk, spectacles low on his nose, one hand resting on Roy Voss's signed confession. "This is not a trial," the judge said, "but there is enough here to determine whether the water claim Mrs. Blackwell has pressed against the Crow property holds any lawful standing." Verena removed her gloves finger by finger. "I deny any involvement with the fire." Roy Voss is a drunk, a thief, and a known liar. If he has dragged my name into his wickedness, it is because weak men prefer to fall against stronger backs." Sheriff Ridley's face did not change. He gave a signed statement. "Signed statements have been purchased before." Tobin Reed shifted his empty sleeve pinned close against his coat. "And so have dirty hands," he said. Verena's eyes flicked toward him with faint distaste. Judge Crane cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed." Tobin said no more, but the heat of him remained in the room like forged coals. The judge turned to Eliza. "Mrs. Crowe, you said you have papers relevant to the water boundary." "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady, though Silas saw her thumb press once against the bandage in her palm. She began with the deed, then the survey map, then the tax record, then the Cattle Association's filing where Verena's claim depended on a ridge marker identified as the northern boundary point. Eliza laid each paper down in order, speaking plainly, never faster than the judge could follow. At first, Verena watched with polite boredom. Then Eliza opened Amos Hartwell's notebook. "My father marked the original creek stones 7 years ago while guiding Reverend Bell's party through the lower canyon," she said. "He drew the bend of the creek and noted the ridge split above the cottonwood stand. The Blackwell claim names the East Ridge as boundary, but the original deed and my father's field notes both name the West Ridge. That puts the creek line fully inside Crow property." Judge Crane leaned forward. Silas watched his finger trace the documents. Outside, a wagon passed slowly, its wheels grinding over frozen mud. No one inside the office spoke. Verena's smile had faded. "That notebook is not a territorial record," she said. "No," Eliza answered. "But it matches the original deed. Your filing does not." Sheriff Ridley placed the brass button, the tobacco pouch, and Tobin's horseshoe statement on the desk beside Roy's confession. "This office will not decide the arson charge today," he said, "but the territorial court will hear it." Judge Crane sat back. "The water claim is invalid as filed. Until a lawful record proves otherwise, the creek remains under Crow property." Verena looked at Silas then, and there was a flash in her eyes like sunlight on a blade. "You have always been a difficult man, Mr. Crow." Silas said nothing. She turned back to Eliza. "And you? You learned quickly how to wear another woman's roof over your head." Eliza rose slowly. She was not tall, not wealthy, not dressed in anything finer than a mended winter dress. But something about her made the room straighten around her. "No, ma'am," she said. "I learned how to keep one from being stolen." The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Verena gathered her gloves, turned, and walked out of the land office with her chin high and her name broken behind her. No one followed. 3 weeks later, word came that she had sold a portion of her cattle interest and made arrangements to leave the territory before spring. Some said she had gone to Portland. Others said San Francisco. A few claimed she meant to fight the charges from a distance with lawyers paid in advance. Boise City had many guesses and little sorrow. No farewell supper was arranged. No church bell marked her leaving. The canyon took no notice at all. Winter still had teeth, and the Crow barn still bore the black scars of the fire. Justice did not stack hay back into a loft. It did not mend burned boards or return strength to horses that had gone short on feed. So Silas went back to work, and Eliza went back with him. Tobin Reed came 2 days after the ruling with a wagon load of salvaged timber and a toolbox older than most men in town. He worked with one arm better than many worked, with 2 bracing planks against his hip, driving nails with heavy, careful blows, cursing only when the wood deserved it. Numajack came at dusk with willow bark for Eliza's throat and a small pouch of bitter-smelling herbs for the mare's leg. He walked the creek line with Silas and pointed out where the first spring grass would show when the snow pulled back. "Water remembers its own path," he said. Silas looked down at the dark thread of creek moving beneath the ice. "I expect people do too." Numajack gave him the smallest hint of a smile. "Some do. Some need someone to show them where it was." By March, the barn wall stood whole again. Eliza mixed a red ochre wash and painted the fresh boards on a windless afternoon, while Silas repaired the lower hinge. The color dried deep and warm against the old gray wood. Silas stepped back. "It looks better than before." Eliza wiped paint from her wrist with a rag. "Some things do after they burn and still stand." He looked at her longer than the sentence required. She looked away first, but not because she was afraid. Spring came late to Boise River Canyon that year, and then all at once. Snow loosened from the red bluffs, the creek shook off its ice, The river ran high and cold, carrying broken branches and winter's dirt eastward under a wide, pale skies. In the garden, green shoots pushed through the black soil. Eliza had turned with hands still tender from healing. Silas began to notice the shape of his days changing. Coffee appeared beside him at the fence line without a word. A warmer blanket found its way onto his cot. The broken porch step, the one he had ignored for 2 years, he repaired before Eliza could trip on it again. At night, she read aloud from one of his books while the stove settled, and he listened without pretending his attention was elsewhere. Sometimes they stood together at sunrise and said nothing. Those were the silences that changed him most. He had known silence as punishment, as distance, as the hollow space left when people were gone and did not come back. With Eliza, silence became something else, a roof, a shared breath, a place where neither had to defend the sorrow they carried. One evening, after the thaw had softened the road and the canyon smelled of wet earth, Eliza found him sitting at the table with Amos Hartwell's letter unfolded before him. She stopped in the doorway. Silas did not hide it. "I have read that paper more times than is sensible," he said. "I have too." He touched the worn crease with one finger. "Some folks inherit land, some inherit debts. Your father left you a promise, and somehow it saved us both." Eliza's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "Father thought you needed a wife." Silas looked toward the stove, then back at her. "Your father was only half right." "How so?" "I did not need a wife the way men in town meant it. I needed someone to make me stop living like I had already been buried." The room went very still. Eliza came to the table and sat across from him. "He saw people that way," she said, "not only as they were, as they might become if somebody gave them room. He was right about you." She looked down at the letter. Outside, the creek moved steadily in the dark. A week later, Silas told her in the mud. They were mending a fence post near the cottonwoods, both of them spattered to the knees from spring thaw. Eliza held the post steady while Silas drove the lower brace into place. The river could be heard beyond the brush, loud with snowmelt. A meadowlark called once from the wire, then flew off toward the ridge. Silas set the hammer down. Eliza looked at him. "What is it, I love you, Eliza?" No speech followed. No fine language came to rescue him. The words stood there rough and plain, with mud on his boots and wind in his coat. Eliza's hand loosened on the fence post. For a long moment she only looked at him. "I know," she said. Then she shook her head slightly, as if correcting a mistake. "I love you too, Silas. I think I have for a while. I just was not certain you wanted to hear it." He stepped closer. "I want to hear it every day I'm given." Her smile came slowly, then fully reaching her eyes and staying there. "Then you will." By summer, the garden had grown wide enough to feed more than 2. During a dry August, Eliza sent baskets of bean squash and early potatoes to neighbors who had once known Silas only by his reputation. Saturday suppers began as 3 people at the table, then 5, then 9. Tobin brought a fiddle he played badly and with great confidence. Numa Jack traded horse medicine by the barn door and sat near the fire, listening more than speaking. Sheriff Ridley stopped by for coffee and left with 2 jars of pickled beans he claimed he had not asked for. Boise City changed its manner toward Silas Crow by degrees. Men who once stepped aside now nodded. Women who once lowered their voices now asked after Eliza's garden. Children came close enough to pet Mercy through the fence. The cabin that had stood for years like a closed fist opened board by board, meal by meal, lamp by lamp. One evening, rain came soft over the canyon after a day of heat. Lantern lights spilled from the barn where neighbors were laughing over Tobin's poor fiddling. The red ochre wall glowed warm in the wet air. The garden drank quietly. The creek ran dark and sure beyond the cottonwoods. Eliza stood on the porch, the same porch where she had once arrived with worn boots, a dead father's letter, and nowhere left to go. Silas came to stand beside her. For a while, neither spoke. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. The rain tapped gently on the porch roof. Behind them, the house was full of light. Before them, the Boise River moved through the darkness, carrying winter away one black shining ribbon at a time.